In the year 318, a group of Jewish men walked into Rome and demanded a meeting with the most powerful religious leader in the Western world. They weren't diplomats, they weren't senators, they were farmers, craftsmen, ordinary people from tiny villages in Judea. But they carried something no one else on earth could claim. They carried the blood of Jesus Christ's own family running through their veins. They called themselves the Desposini, a Greek word meaning belonging to the master. And they had come to Rome with a simple demand: give us back our churches, recognize our bishops, restore the authority that was stolen from us. Pope Sylvester listened to their case, and then he dismissed them. He told them the mother church was no longer in Jerusalem, it was in Rome now. Their bloodline, their heritage, their direct family connection to Jesus himself, none of it mattered anymore. After that meeting, the Desposini vanished from recorded history. No more petitions, no more demands, just silence. So what happened to the physical descendants of the family of Jesus? Where did they come from? What did they endure? And why does almost nobody talk about them today? To answer that, we need to go all the way back to a small town in Galilee about 2,000 years ago. And what we find there is going to challenge almost everything you think you know about the early church. Everyone knows Jesus grew up in Nazareth. What most people don't think about is that he grew up in a family, a real physical crowded household in a dusty village where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nazareth in the 1st century was not a city. It wasn't even a proper town by most standards. Archaeologists estimate it had somewhere between 200 and 400 people. Everyone knew everyone. Families were large, homes were small, and privacy was essentially non-existent. The Gospels of Matthew and Mark both mention his brothers by name: James, Joses, Simon, and Judas. They also mention sisters, though they don't bother to name them, which tells you something about how women were regarded in 1st century Palestine. Most scholars believe there were at least 2 sisters, possibly more. Now, different Christian traditions disagree on what brothers means here. Catholics and Orthodox Christians have traditionally taught that Mary remained a virgin her entire life, which means these brothers and sisters were either cousins or children from a previous marriage of Joseph. Protestants generally take the simpler reading and say they were the biological children of Mary and Joseph, born after Jesus. For the purposes of this story, the distinction doesn't change the fundamental point. Whether they were half-brothers, step-brothers, or cousins, they were family. They shared a household, they shared meals, they shared a last name in a culture where family meant everything. In 1st century Judaism, your family defined you. Your lineage determined your social standing, your marriage prospects, your role in religious life. And this particular family traced its lineage back to King David himself. And here's what's fascinating. During Jesus' actual ministry, his family didn't believe in him. The Gospel of John says it plainly, for not even his brothers believed in him. That's John chapter 7, verse 5. When Jesus was out performing miracles and drawing massive crowds, his own brothers were skeptical. Mark's Gospel even records a moment where Jesus' family came to take him home because they thought he had lost his mind. Mark chapter 3, verse 21. His own relatives said he was out of his mind. Think about that for a second. Imagine your older brother starts claiming to be the Messiah. You grew up with him. You saw him stub his toe. You heard him snore. You watched him learn carpentry from your father. You argued with him over chores. How exactly are you supposed to process the idea that this person is the Son of God? So during the years of Jesus' public ministry, his brothers kept their distance. They weren't among the 12 apostles. They weren't part of the inner circle. They were watching from the sidelines, probably worried, probably embarrassed, probably confused. And we know they weren't at the crucifixion. When Jesus was dying on the cross, he looked down and saw his mother Mary and the apostle John standing there. He told John to take care of Mary as if she were his own mother. If James and the other brothers had been present, Jesus wouldn't have needed to make that arrangement. Their absence at the most important moment in their brother's life tells you everything about where things stood. But then something changed, and it changed everything. After the crucifixion, something happened to James, the eldest of Jesus' brothers, that completely transformed him. It's one of the most dramatic personal reversals in the entire Bible, and most people barely notice it. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians contains one of the earliest Christian documents we have, a creed that scholars believe dates to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. This creed was already being recited by Christians before Paul even wrote it down, and in that creed, Paul lists the people who saw the risen Jesus. Peter, the 12, 500 people at once, and then, separately, specifically, James. Jesus appeared to his own brother. We don't know the details of that encounter. The Bible doesn't describe it. We don't know if James was alone, where it happened, what was said. All we know is that Jesus, after his resurrection, made a point of appearing to the brother who hadn't believed in him. Whatever James saw, whatever happened in that moment, it turned a skeptic into the most devoted believer imaginable. Within just a few years, James wasn't just a follower. He was the leader of the entire church in Jerusalem. Not Peter, not Paul, James. The brother who hadn't even shown up to the crucifixion was now running the whole operation. This is one of the most underappreciated facts in Christian history. The brother of Jesus became the single most important figure in the original Jerusalem church. Paul calls him a pillar of the church in Galatians chapter 2. When Peter escaped from prison in Acts chapter 12, the first thing he said was, "Go tell James," not "go tell the other apostles." Go tell James. At the Council of Jerusalem, described in Acts chapter 15, the first major gathering to decide church policy, it was James who delivered the final verdict on whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law. Peter spoke. Paul and Barnabas spoke. But James had the last word. James earned the nickname the Just because of his extraordinary devotion to prayer and righteousness. The early historian Hegesippus, writing in the 2nd century, described James as a man who never drank wine, never ate meat, never cut his hair. He was allowed to enter the temple alone, a privilege granted to no other Christian leader. He spent so much time on his knees, praying in the temple, that his knees reportedly became calloused and hard like a camel's. The people of Jerusalem called him the bulwark of the people because they believed his constant prayers were protecting the city. He was respected not just by Christians, but by many Jews as well, because he still faithfully observed the Jewish law while believing that his brother was the Messiah. He walked a tightrope between two worlds, trying to hold together a movement that included both devout Jews who kept every commandment and Gentile converts who had never set foot in a synagogue. James wrote the epistle that bears his name, a letter in the New Testament that focuses not on theology, but on practical living. "Faith without works is dead," he wrote. It's the most Jewish-sounding book in the entire New Testament, and that makes sense. James was a Jew who believed his brother was the Christ. He didn't stop being Jewish. He brought his entire heritage with him into the new faith. But walking that tightrope between worlds made him a target. And the way he died is one of the most harrowing stories in early Christian history. In the year 62, something happened that would send shockwaves through Jerusalem. The Roman governor Festus died, and there was a gap before his replacement, a man named Albinus, could arrive from Rome. During that gap, there was no Roman authority in Jerusalem to keep order. The high priest at the time was a man named Ananus ben Ananus. He was aggressive, politically ambitious, and he belonged to the Sadducee faction, which was hostile to the growing Christian movement. Ananus saw an opportunity. With no Roman governor watching, he convened an emergency session of the Sanhedrin and accused James of breaking the law. What happened next was recorded by two separate ancient sources, which is remarkable because it means both Jewish and Christian historians agreed on the basic facts. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was not a Christian and had no reason to embellish the story in James's favor, wrote in his Antiquities of the Jews that James was condemned by the Sanhedrin and stoned to death. Josephus even noted that many Jews in Jerusalem were outraged by the illegal proceedings. The Sanhedrin had no authority to convene a capital trial without the Roman governor's approval, and Ananus had overstepped his bounds. The backlash was so severe that when Albinus finally arrived, he had Ananus removed from the high priesthood. The Christian historian Hegesippus gives a more dramatic and detailed account. According to him, the scribes and Pharisees brought James to the pinnacle of the temple during Passover, when the city was packed with pilgrims. They stood him up where everyone could see him, and they demanded that he renounce Jesus before the assembled crowd. They expected him to comply. After all, James was an old man by now, and the threat of death tends to focus the mind. Instead, James proclaimed that Jesus was the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of God, and that he would return on the clouds of heaven. The crowd below erupted. Some began singing hosannas. The Pharisees on the roof panicked. They shoved James off the pinnacle of the temple. The fall didn't kill him. He landed, broken but alive, and managed to get to his knees. He began to pray, "Lord God, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." The same words, almost exactly, that his brother had spoken from the cross decades earlier. The crowd below began stoning him as he prayed. One of the priests, a descendant of the Rechabites mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, tried to stop them. "Cease," he shouted. "The just man is praying for us." But it was too late. A laundryman standing nearby, a fuller by trade, picked up one of his heavy wooden clubs, the kind used to beat wet garments, and smashed James over the head with a single blow. James the Just, brother of Jesus Christ, first Bishop of Jerusalem, was dead. The death of James shocked the entire city. Even non-Christian Jews were horrified that the most righteous man in Jerusalem had been murdered through an illegal kangaroo court. Josephus went so far as to suggest that the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans 8 years later was divine punishment for what happened to James. Whether or not you believe that, the timing is hard to ignore. The most righteous man in Jerusalem was killed in 62. And the city was obliterated in 70. But for the family of Jesus, the murder of James was just the beginning of their troubles. After James was killed, the Jerusalem church needed a new leader, and once again, they chose a family member. His name was Simeon, sometimes written as Simeon, and he was the son of Clopas. Now, Clopas was the brother of Joseph, which made Simeon a first cousin of Jesus. Some traditions say Clopas was actually the same person as Cleopas, one of the two disciples who encountered the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. If that's true, then Simeon's own father had walked with the resurrected Christ without recognizing him until the moment of the breaking of bread. Simeon took over the leadership of the Jerusalem church at an incredibly dangerous time. Within 4 years of his appointment, the Jewish revolt against Rome erupted in 66. Radical Jewish nationalists known as the Zealots had seized control of Jerusalem. The Romans were marshalling their legions. Everyone knew a catastrophe was coming. According to early Christian tradition preserved by Eusebius, Simeon received a divine warning that the Christian community needed to flee Jerusalem before the siege began. Some accounts say it was a prophetic revelation. Others say it was simply good judgment based on Jesus' own warnings about the destruction of the temple, recorded in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21. Jesus had told his followers that when they saw armies surrounding Jerusalem, they should flee to the mountains without looking back. Whatever the source of the warning, Simeon acted decisively. He led the entire congregation, every man, woman, and child, across the Jordan River to a small Gentile town called Pella in the Decapolis region. It was a calculated move. Pella was far enough from the fighting to be safe, and it was a Gentile town that the Romans had no reason to target. In the year 70, the Romans under General Titus broke through the walls of Jerusalem after a horrific siege that had lasted months. The famine inside the city had become so severe that Josephus records people eating leather, eating straw, and, in the most extreme cases, doing things too horrible to describe. When the soldiers finally entered, they massacred the population and set fire to the temple. Titus reportedly tried to save the temple, but his soldiers were in a frenzy and the flames spread beyond control. The temple, the center of Jewish religious life for 1,000 years, the place where James had prayed until his knees turned to stone, was reduced to rubble. Only the western retaining wall survived, the wall that still stands today as the most sacred site in Judaism. Hundreds of thousands of people perished. The Jewish world, as it had existed for centuries, was shattered. The priesthood was gone. The sacrificial system was finished. The Sanhedrin was disbanded. An entire way of life ended in fire and blood. But the Christians of Jerusalem survived because Simeon had gotten them out in time. After the destruction, when it was safe, Simeon brought his flock back to what remained of Jerusalem. The city was devastated, little more than ruins and Roman military camps, but the Christian community rebuilt. It was smaller now, more vulnerable, but it endured, and it was still led by the family of Jesus. Simeon led the Jerusalem church for decades, an extraordinarily long tenure, but the Roman emperors had a problem with the family of Jesus that went beyond religion. The family claimed descent from King David, and Rome was deeply uncomfortable with anyone in Palestine who could claim royal Jewish blood. Messianic expectations were still alive among the Jewish people. Anyone with a credible claim to David's throne was a potential figurehead for rebellion. Emperor Vespasian, who came to power in 69, ordered that all descendants of David be hunted down and killed. It was a systematic campaign of genealogical extermination. His son, Domitian, continued the policy with even greater intensity. And this is where we get one of the most remarkable stories in early Christian history, a story that comes directly from ancient sources and sounds almost too dramatic to be real. Sometime during the reign of Domitian, which lasted from 81 to 96, informers reported to the emperor that there were still living grandsons of Jude, the brother of Jesus. These weren't just any Christians. They were blood relatives of the man whose followers had spread across the entire Roman Empire, and they claimed descent from David. Domitian was a paranoid and cruel emperor. He ordered the grandsons of Jude brought before him in Rome. The historian Hegesippus, whose account was preserved by the later historian Eusebius, tells us what happened in that imperial audience chamber. These two young men, whose names are believed to have been Zochar and James, based on records preserved at the Bodleian Library at Oxford, were dragged before the Roman emperor. Domitian asked them point-blank if they were descendants of David. They said yes. There was no point lying. Everyone knew who they were. Then he asked them about their property and their wealth, trying to determine if they had the resources to fund an insurrection. They told the emperor that between the two of them, they owned about 39 acres of land, valued at about 9,000 denarii, and they worked it themselves with their own hands to pay their taxes and feed their families. Then, to prove their point, they held out their hands for the emperor to inspect. Their palms were calloused, cracked, and rough from years of digging, planting, and harvesting. These were the hands of subsistence farmers, not revolutionaries, not kings in waiting, just men who worked the soil from sunup to sundown. Then Domitian asked the question that really mattered. What is the kingdom of Christ? When will it come? Is it a political kingdom? Are you planning something? The grandsons of Jude told the emperor that Christ's kingdom was not of this world. It was not earthly or political. It would come at the end of the age, when Christ would return in glory to judge the living and the dead. They were echoing their great-uncle's own words. Jesus himself had said essentially the same thing to Pontius Pilate decades earlier, when Pilate asked him if he was a king. Domitian looked at these rough-handed farmers, heard their talk of a spiritual kingdom that would arrive only at the end of time, and decided they were beneath his concern. He waved his hand. He dismissed them with contempt and let them go. But the story doesn't end with their release. Hegesippus tells us that after being freed, these grandsons of Jude went home and became leaders of churches in their communities. They were respected and honored both because of their courage in testifying before the emperor and because they were relatives of the Lord. They governed churches throughout Palestine. They were looked up to. People followed them because of who their family was. They led those churches all the way until the reign of Trajan, which began in 98. At the end of the 1st century, barely 60 years after the crucifixion, the Christian communities in Palestine were still being led by the blood relatives of Jesus. The original model of family leadership was holding even under imperial persecution. Meanwhile, old Simeon was still alive and still leading the Jerusalem church. He had survived the Jewish revolt. He had survived the destruction of the temple. He had survived Vespasian's purges. He had survived Domitian's persecution and the arrest of his relatives. The man had an almost supernatural resilience. But Emperor Trajan would prove to be the end. Under Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117, Christianity was formally criminalized through an exchange of letters between Trajan and Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia. Pliny had written to ask how he should handle the growing number of Christians in his province. Trajan's reply established the first official Roman policy on Christianity. Christians were not to be actively sought out, but if they were denounced by name and refused to recant by offering sacrifice to the Roman gods, they were to be executed. In Palestine, a dual persecution broke out. The Romans were hunting both descendants of David and professing Christians. Simeon was both. He was a marked man twice over. Informers reported Simeon to the Roman governor Atticus, and these weren't just random accusers. According to Hegesippus, some of the informers came from heretical Christian sects, breakaway groups that had split from the mainstream church over theological disputes. They saw an opportunity to destroy a rival leader by turning him in to the Romans. The internal politics of early Christianity could be just as vicious as the external persecution. Simeon was arrested and brought before Atticus. He was over 100 years old at the time. Most ancient sources place his age at 120, though some historians consider that number symbolic, an echo of Moses, who also died at 120. Regardless of his exact age, what happened next was brutal. Simeon was tortured for days. Not a quick execution, but prolonged, systematic torture designed to break his will and force him to deny Christ. The Roman officials were reportedly astonished that a man so elderly could endure such sustained suffering without giving in. He never renounced his faith. He never denied his heritage. He never named other believers. In the end, around the year 107, Simeon, son of Clopas, cousin of Jesus Christ, second bishop of Jerusalem, was crucified. He died the same way his Lord had died, nailed to a cross, and he endured it with the same quiet steadfastness that had defined his entire extraordinary life. His death marked a turning point in the history of Christianity. After Simeon, there were still Jewish bishops of Jerusalem, but the direct family connection was growing thinner with each passing generation. The era of leadership by Jesus' immediate relatives was drawing to a close, but it didn't end all at once. According to the church historian Eusebius, there were 15 Jewish bishops of Jerusalem in total, an unbroken succession of circumcised Jewish believers, every single one of them part of the Hebrew Christian community. This line stretched from James the Just all the way to a man named Judah Kyriakos. Judah Kyriakos is one of the most fascinating and overlooked figures in this entire saga. According to the 4th century writer Epiphanius of Salamis, Judah was the great-grandson of Jude, the brother of Jesus. That made him a great-great-nephew of Jesus Christ himself. He was the 15th and final Jewish bishop of Jerusalem. His tenure coincided with one of the most catastrophic events in Jewish history, the Bar Kokhba revolt. In 132, a charismatic Jewish military leader named Simon Bar Kokhba launched a massive rebellion against Rome. The famous Rabbi Akiva publicly declared Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah, and hundreds of thousands of Jews rallied to his cause. For a brief, spectacular moment, the rebels actually succeeded. They drove the Romans out of Jerusalem. They established an independent Jewish state. They struck their own coins. They held the Holy City for nearly 3 years. But the Roman response, when it came, was devastating beyond anything the Jews had experienced before. Emperor Hadrian sent his best generals with 6 full legions, an overwhelming military force. The revolt was crushed by 135, and Hadrian's punishment made the destruction of 70 look almost merciful by comparison. Jerusalem was razed to its foundations and rebuilt as a pagan Roman city called Aelia Capitolina. A temple to Jupiter was erected on the Temple Mount, where the Jewish temple had once stood. A statue of Hadrian himself was placed where the Holy of Holies had been. And then came the decree that changed everything. Jews were banned from entering the city entirely, under penalty of death. Any circumcised person found within the city limits would be executed on the spot. This ban included Jewish Christians, even those like Judah Kyriakos, who had refused to support Bar Kokhba's revolt, precisely because they didn't recognize him as the Messiah. It didn't matter. If you were circumcised, you were banned. Period. The Desposini, who had been based in Jerusalem and the surrounding region for over a century, were suddenly exiles in their own ancestral homeland, the city where James had led the church, where Simeon had rebuilt after the first destruction, where generation after generation of Jesus' relatives had served as bishops, was now forbidden to them. After 135, the Jerusalem church was reorganized by outside authorities. A Gentile bishop named Marcus was appointed by the Metropolitan of Caesarea. For the first time in the history of Christianity, The church in Jerusalem, the mother church, the original community, was not led by a Jewish believer. The unbroken chain of Hebrew bishops, stretching back to James, the brother of Jesus himself, was severed forever. Judah Kyriakos survived the revolt. According to later sources, he lived until around 148, well into the reign of Emperor Antoninus Pius. But he could no longer function as a resident bishop of Jerusalem. He was a bishop in exile, maintaining whatever authority he could among the scattered Jewish Christian communities of Galilee. His actual power was gone. With Judah Kyriakos, the last formal institutional link between the Jerusalem church and the family of Jesus was broken. But here's the part of this story that nobody talks about. The Desposini didn't just lose their churches and their titles. They lost something far more valuable. They lost control of their own family story. And what replaced it would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had actually known Jesus. The Desposini as a broader community didn't vanish overnight. They retreated to the Galilean countryside, to the villages of Nazareth and Kochaba, where their families had maintained roots for generations. These were the same villages that Sextus Julius Africanus mentioned when he wrote about the family's genealogical practices around the year 220. Africanus tells us that King Herod had tried to eliminate evidence of Davidic lineage centuries earlier by burning the public genealogical records. Herod was an Idumean, not a true Israelite, and he was pathologically insecure about his lack of legitimate Jewish ancestry, so he ordered the archives destroyed, hoping that if nobody could prove their descent from David, nobody could challenge his right to rule. But the relatives of Jesus were not so easily erased. A few careful families had kept private records. They preserved their genealogies from memory and from personal family documents, passed down from parent to child, like sacred heirlooms. They took pride in maintaining the knowledge of their ancestry, even when that knowledge could get them killed. Africanus says the Desposini drew their genealogy from memory and from the book of daily records as faithfully as possible. These were families who knew exactly who they were, who their ancestors were, and how they connected back to the household in Nazareth. In a world where most people couldn't trace their family back more than 2 or 3 generations, the Desposini maintained meticulous records going back centuries. According to Malachi Martin, every early community of Jewish Christians was governed by a Desposini patriarch. Each of these leaders carried one of the traditional family names: Zachary, Joseph, John, James, Joses, Simeon, Matthias. But none of them were ever named Jesus. That name was set apart, too sacred for anyone else in the family to carry, even those who bore his blood. Some of these leaders claimed descent from both King David through the royal line and from the priestly line of Aaron through other family branches. If those claims were accurate, it meant they held dual authority: the right to rule and the right to serve at the altar. An extraordinary concentration of symbolic power in a handful of farming families from Palestinian villages nobody had heard of. There's another dimension to this story that most people miss entirely. The Desposini weren't just a family. They were custodians of a particular understanding of who Jesus was and what his message meant. And when they were silenced, that understanding went with them. Think about what was lost. The Desposini had something that no theologian in Rome or Constantinople could ever possess. They had family memories. They had stories passed down from generation to generation, from people who had actually lived with Jesus, eaten with him, watched him grow up. They knew what he ate, how he spoke, what made him laugh. They knew the private Jesus, not just the public miracle worker. When arguments broke out in the early church about what Jesus would have wanted, whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law, how the Sabbath should be observed, whether the dietary rules still applied. The Desposini could appeal to something that no Greek-speaking bishop in Corinth could match. They could say, "We knew him, our family remembers, and you're getting it wrong." But here's the cruel twist. The further Christianity moved from its Jewish roots, the more the Desposini's intimate knowledge became a threat rather than an asset. The Gentile church was building a theology based on Greek philosophy, explaining the nature of Christ through concepts like hypostasis and homoousios, terms that would have meant nothing to James or Simeon. And the family that had known Jesus as a living, breathing person was being told by people who had never met him that they didn't understand who he really was. Imagine that. Imagine being the grandson of a man who had shared a bedroom with Jesus Christ and being told by a bishop in Alexandria that your understanding of Jesus is heretical. That's exactly what happened. Jewish Christian groups like the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, communities that almost certainly included Desposini families, were gradually pushed to the margins and then branded as heretics. Not because they denied Jesus. They worshipped him as the Messiah. Their crime was that they kept the Sabbath. They followed the dietary laws. They used a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. They practiced a form of Christianity that was, by any honest measure, closer to what James and the original Jerusalem church had practiced than anything happening in the marble basilicas of Rome. The Ebionites called themselves the poor, which is what their Hebrew name means, and that's what they were. Poor communities scattered across Palestine and Syria, holding on to a version of the faith that the powerful institutional church wanted erased. Some of them probably had no idea that their great-great-grandmothers had cooked meals for the apostles. Others knew exactly who they were and kept the genealogies hidden the way you'd hide a treasure in wartime. And then there was a man named Conon. This is a story almost nobody knows. In the 3rd century, during one of the Roman persecutions, a man from Nazareth named Conon was arrested and brought before a judge. The judge asked him who he was. Conon said he was from Nazareth and that he was of the family of Christ. Not a follower of Christ, not a believer in Christ. He said he was family. He identified himself by blood. In the middle of a Roman persecution, when claiming any connection to Christianity could get you killed, this man stood up and said, "I am from his family." Conon was martyred, but his name survived in records maintained by families in the Galilee region, families that the Cambridge scholar Richard Bauckham has traced in genealogical documents going back to the 2nd century. Conon wasn't a legend. He was a real person with a real bloodline, making a real claim in front of a real Roman judge. And he died for it. That means at least 200 years after the crucifixion, there were people in Nazareth who still identified themselves as relatives of Jesus. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, by blood. They knew their lineage. They kept their records, and when the moment came, they were willing to die for the name they carried. That's the kind of conviction you don't get from reading a theology book. That comes from knowing in your bones that the man the whole world argues about was your family. For the next 2 centuries after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Desposini lived in a kind of quiet twilight. They were known within their communities. They maintained their traditions, but they were increasingly invisible to the wider Christian world, which was now centered in Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. The shift in Christianity's center of gravity was seismic. Within a single generation of the apostles, the faith had gone from a Jewish movement led by the family of Jesus to a Gentile institution led by Greek-speaking bishops who owed nothing to the household of Nazareth. Paul's missions had opened the floodgates. Gentile converts poured in by the tens of thousands. The theology was being articulated in Greek philosophical categories borrowed from Plato and Aristotle. The liturgy was conducted in Greek and Latin. The Jewish practices that Jesus himself had observed, the Sabbath, the feast days, the dietary laws, were being abandoned as obsolete remnants of the Old Covenant. In the Galilean villages, the Desposini kept the Sabbath. They observed Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles. They circumcised their sons. They studied Torah. They believed in Jesus as the Messiah, but they worshipped in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the Christians in Rome and utterly familiar to the Jews down the street. They were caught between two worlds, rejected by mainstream Judaism for believing in Jesus and marginalized by mainstream Christianity for remaining Jewish. It was a lonely position, and it only got lonelier as the centuries passed. But the Desposini had one last card to play, one final chance to reclaim what had been taken from them. And when that moment came, in a Roman audience chamber in the year 318, everything the family of Jesus had endured for 3 centuries came down to a single conversation. And then came the year 318 and the meeting with Pope Sylvester that we started this story with. The meeting that changed everything, or rather confirmed that everything had already changed. Constantine had legalized Christianity just 5 years earlier. The church was being reorganized with imperial backing. Bishops were receiving political authority, tax exemptions, and government funding. The institutional church was becoming a power structure on a scale that James and Simeon could never have imagined. The Desposini saw this transformation happening and decided it was now or never. If the church was being rebuilt, they wanted their place restored. A delegation led by a man named Joseph, the oldest among them, traveled to Rome and secured an audience with Sylvester. They presented their demands: revoke the Greek bishops, appoint Desposini bishops in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, and Alexandria, restore the financial contributions to Jerusalem as the mother church, reintroduce the Sabbath and the biblical feast days. Sylvester said no to everything. The mother church is in Rome now. Accept the Greek bishops. The Jewish law is fulfilled and superseded. This conversation is over. Martin notes something remarkable about this rejection. Neither Sylvester, nor any of the 32 popes who came before him, nor any pope who came after, ever publicly acknowledged or emphasized the existence of at least 3 well-documented and authentic lines of blood descent from the family of Jesus. The Desposini were known. Their lineage was recorded. Their claims were never refuted. They were simply ignored. After 318, the Desposini disappear from the historical record. The last documented meeting between the institutional church and the family of its founder ends in a bureaucratic dismissal and then silence. What happened after that? Several possibilities, and none of them have happy endings. Some Desposini probably assimilated into mainstream Christianity, abandoning their distinctive practices and their family identity to survive in a world that no longer valued either. Some likely lost track of their lineage over the generations. Without institutional support, without public archives, family trees fade. Within 3 or 4 generations of the meeting with Sylvester, most Desposini families may have simply forgotten who they were. The children stopped asking. The grandchildren never knew there was a question to ask, and some may have held on longer than anyone realizes. We already talked about Conon in the 3rd century. Bockham's research suggests that certain families in the Galilee region preserved genealogical traditions that may stretch back even further. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are careful academic arguments based on real documentary evidence. Then there's the fiction, the Da Vinci Code, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, the Priory of Sion, all of it built on the false premise that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and founded a secret European dynasty. None of it holds up to 5 minutes of serious historical scrutiny. The real Desposini weren't hiding in French castles. They were farming 39 acres of rocky Palestinian soil and praying that the next emperor wouldn't order their execution. The story of the Desposini matters because it reveals something essential about how Christianity became what it is today, and it raises questions that most churches would prefer not to answer. Think about what the early church looked like before Rome took control. There was no pope. There was no Vatican. There were no cardinals, no elaborate liturgies in Latin, no stained glass cathedrals. There was a family, a Jewish family in a small town, leading small communities of believers who gathered in homes and shared meals and remembered the stories of a man they had known personally. The first church service wasn't held in a basilica. It was held around a dinner table. The first communion wasn't performed with silver chalices and wafers. It was bread broken by the hands of people who had broken bread with Jesus himself. The first sermon wasn't delivered from a marble pulpit. It was spoken by James, a man who had grown up sharing a room with the Messiah. That's the Christianity that existed before the institutions, before the councils, before the creeds. And the people who embodied it most fully were the Desposini. When we talk about getting back to the early church, which is something Christians of every denomination love to say, we rarely mean what we think we mean. Getting back to the early church doesn't mean contemporary worship music and casual dress codes. It means a Jewish family in Galilee keeping the Sabbath, observing the feasts, and telling stories about their brother and cousin and uncle who rose from the dead. It means calloused hands and dirt floors, and a faith so intimate it didn't need a building. That's what was lost when the Desposini were dismissed. Not just a bloodline, not just a political claim, an entire way of being Christian that the world has almost completely forgotten. In the beginning, the faith was a family affair. James ran the church. Simeon succeeded him. Jude's grandsons governed communities. Authority flowed through blood and memory, and shared meals in small houses where everyone could remember the man who started it all. That model was replaced over 3 centuries by an institutional hierarchy headquartered in Rome, operating in Greek and Latin, governed by bishops who had never seen Palestine, and whose authority derived from apostolic succession rather than family connection. Both models had strengths. The family model preserved intimacy, continuity, and direct witness. The institutional model enabled growth, organization, and adaptation to a diverse, multicultural world. But the transition from one to the other was not gentle, and it was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people, and it came at the cost of erasing the very family that made Christianity possible. There's a deep irony that's hard to miss. The faith that teaches its followers to call God Father, the faith that emphasizes spiritual family and belonging, the faith that calls the church the body of Christ. That faith told the actual, physical family of Christ that their blood didn't count. James the Just, who prayed so hard his knees turned to leather and was martyred for refusing to deny his brother. Simeon, who led his people to safety before Jerusalem burned, who survived 4 emperors, and who was crucified at an age when most people had been dead for decades. The grandsons of Jude, who stood before the most powerful man in the world and showed him their calloused hands and told him the kingdom of Christ is not of this world. Judah Kyriakos, the last Jewish bishop, who held his title even as the Romans banned him from his own city. These are not fictional characters. These are documented historical figures, attested by multiple independent sources, Christian, Jewish, and Roman. They are as real as any figure from the ancient world. And yet most Christians have never heard their names. The most sacred family line in human history didn't end with a dramatic last stand. It ended with a handshake and a closed door in a Roman office, a shake of the head from a pope who had bigger concerns than a group of Galilean farmers with ancient genealogies and outdated traditions. And somewhere out there, scattered across the centuries, mixed into the vast ocean of human genealogy, the blood of the family of Jesus flows on, in people who will never know it, in families that lost the records generations ago, in descendants who have no idea that their ancestors once stood before emperors and professed, with quiet certainty, that the kingdom of Christ is not of this world. That is the story of the Desposini, the forgotten family of Jesus, a story that was buried for 1700 years, until now. But the Desposini weren't the only ones the early church tried to silence. There were entire gospels, entire communities, entire versions of Christianity that were declared heretical and erased from history. And some of what they believed will genuinely shock you. That story is the video on screen right now. Click it. And if you made it to the end of this one, you're clearly not someone who accepts the surface-level version of things. Hit subscribe. The stories I'm covering next go even deeper than this one, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming.